Food, shelter, medical care, phrased in the cold language of compliance. Marta read the notice twice and watched a guard glance at it as if it were just another maintenance reminder. The sign offered safety without kindness, and it humiliated her. She had never seen a promise to feed her posted publicly in Berlin. A second notice listed rules for mail. What could be written, how many pages, what would be censored. Marta traced the lines with her eyes and understood that even contact with home would be regulated. She gained a channel to speak, but paid with a muzzle. Rules could protect and constrain at the same time. On December the 13th, the first morning in the mess hall, she expected substitute coffee and dense bread. The door opened, and the smell of meat and hot fat hit her so hard, her eyes watered before she could stop them. A tray landed in her hands. A meat patty under brown gravy, mashed potatoes, peas, white bread, and a slice of fruit pie with a glossy surface. Her pride tried to interpret it as provocation. Her stomach interpreted it as survival. She stood still for one extra second, afraid this was staged humiliation, then saw staff at the end of the line eating similar meals. That cleared the fog. This was normal here. The cost was immediate collapse of her old explanations, because a system that can feed its own soldiers can feed prisoners too, and therefore her earlier hunger had not been inevitable. Marta cut the meat and took a bite, and heat and salt spread across her tongue with a vividness that tightened her throat. She kept chewing because stopping would mean confronting what the taste implied. Tears fell onto the tray without permission, and she paid for nourishment with exposure because she could not hide that she was crying over food like a child. Around her, other German women ate and cried in different rhythms, metal scraping metal in a repetitive confession. Marta heard forks drag across trays and remembered how, in France, the sound of eating had been quiet because there had been so little to eat. Shared survival arrived as a chorus, and its consequence was shame. Gratitude and humiliation used the same muscles. She ate too fast, as if the food might be revoked, and she found herself saving one piece of bread in her pocket like contraband. The result was a full stomach that felt unreal. The cost was that she began treating abundance as something temporary and punishable because her body had been trained by shortage to expect loss. That night, Marta wrote in her notebook, describing the meal in simple terms, then wrote a question. What does it mean when the enemy feeds you better than your own state? And stopped. She stared at the unfinished line until the ink dried. The question did not resolve. Instead, it lodged, and the price of writing it was that she could no longer pretend she did not know what she was asking. 2 hours after breakfast, her stomach seized into cramps. Nausea rose and she vomited into a basin, her body rejecting abundance as if it were poison. A camp doctor, Walsh, examined her and explained that, after prolonged hunger, the body must relearn feeding slowly. He ordered smaller portions, careful pacing, and rest. Recovery became a schedule, and the cost was anger. Not at the camp, but at the damage done before she arrived, because even healing now had to be managed. Walsh's adjustments worked in fragments. Marta stopped vomiting as often, then stopped shaking as often, then began to sleep without waking from abdominal pain. The camp's discipline stabilized her, and that stabilization carried a bitter fee, dependence, because she had to trust the routines of the side she had been trained to despise. In the infirmary, a nurse named Margaret cleaned her face and spoke quietly about starving women she had seen in France, who died the same way, weak, vomiting, unable to reclaim their bodies in time. Marta took Margaret's hand as if touch could anchor her, and Margaret let her, as if this were also part of medical work. It eased the immediate panic, and it expanded her grief, because compassion widens the list of the dead. Back in the barracks, Marta tried to balance her survival by eating less, paying for the camp's food with self-denial. The cramps eased, but the cost was a new moral habit. She began using hunger as punishment because she did not know how else to settle debt. In January 1945, she received Red Cross paper and wrote home. The form required simple facts and discouraged camp descriptions, and Marta followed the rules because she feared the letter would be stopped. She wrote that she was alive and safe, then started to mention the mess hall and crossed the sentence out until the page looked wounded. The letter could travel, but she paid with self-erasure, deleting the single fact that explained why she was changing. Weeks passed, and mail distribution became an evening ritual that organized despair. An officer named Moore stood with a sack of envelopes. In the barracks, Johanna stood up too fast one morning and folded as if her spine had unlatched. Marta caught her and felt ribs under fabric like stripped piano keys, then helped her sit and share a sip of watery substitute coffee. Johanna stayed conscious, but Marta paid for the rescue with certainty. Hunger was no longer discomfort. It was taking bodies. Marta asked a superior about rations, choosing words as if politeness could create food. She was told transport was disrupted and complaints damaged morale. She was reminded that everyone sacrifices. The answer produced what it was designed to produce: silence, and the price was knowledge. Hunger could be enforced by procedure, because asking itself was treated as disloyalty. By autumn 1944, retreat became routine, and routine became panic. Orders contradicted each other, bridges failed, and the message headers Marta handled grew shorter and sharper, as if language itself were running out. The unit kept moving anyway, and Marta began to notice who still had cigarettes and who did not, which is how suspicion enters a starving mind. In November, near Metz, the retreat finally lost its shape. Roads clogged with damaged vehicles and conflicting instructions, and Marta chose to abandon equipment that could not be moved quickly, staying with the group because breath mattered more than gear. She survived, but she crossed a line from service to endurance, and endurance does not leave room for faith. The order to surrender arrived without ceremony. Marta raised her hands because the alternative was death that no longer carried meaning, and she watched American faces with the shock of their youth and intact uniforms. No one shot her. Instead, her fear had nowhere clean to settle, because the enemy did not match the stories she had been trained to recite. A young American soldier stepped close enough for Marta to see clean fingernails and unhurried hands. He pulled a small bar of chocolate from his pocket, unwrapped it with practiced ease, and held it out as if the gesture required no speech. Marta shook her head and stepped back. She kept her pride, but it cost her humiliation. Her mouth filled with saliva, and her body wanted what her ideology rejected. The soldier shrugged and ate it himself, chewing as if sweetness were ordinary. Later, when Marta was searched and her pockets emptied into a tray, she watched her small, personal items become inventory. She was now contained, and the cost was flattening. Identity reduced to what could be listed. That night, in a temporary holding area, Marta curled into herself and tried to rebuild the enemy as a necessary monster. Johanna whispered that the Americans looked well-fed and that they had been lied to. Marta did not answer. Silence protected her from choosing a side in her own head, but it cost her the last comfort of certainty. Germany no longer sounded like shelter. Days later, transport doors shut, and the vehicle began to move. Marta pressed her palm against the vibrating metal wall and pictured the edge of chocolate peeking from torn foil, then tasted salt air, and understood an ocean was being put between her and Berlin. On the ship, she slept in crowded compartments, endured seasickness on an empty stomach, and learned to drink water in measured swallows. Distance became irreversible, and pride remained the only thing she could still claim, carrying its own hunger. A craving she would not admit. If this first section is pulling you in, the way small physical details can expose a whole system, stay with the story. Like the episode, subscribe and keep notifications on, because the next part is where Marta's hunger stops being a symptom and becomes evidence. On December 12, 1944, America smelled less like smoke and more like soil, and Marta's first impression was not freedom, but distance. She stepped off a truck in Mississippi and saw pine trees beyond the wire, and the quiet landscape felt like an insult to Europe's ruin. It disoriented her, and the cost was that the quiet made her loneliness louder, because there was no shelling here to explain fear. The camp was called Camp McCain, built like an orderly town designed to contain people rather than kill them. Marta moved through intake lines, surrendered her name to a roster, accepted a barracks assignment, and submitted to delousing procedures that felt more clinical than cruel. Predictability replaced chaos, and that steadiness carried a sting. It forced her to ask why her own life had been managed through scarcity instead. She noticed that her group was counted again and again, head counts in the yard, numbers on forms, and one number repeated with bureaucratic precision. 43 German women, bunks laid out with the efficiency of a warehouse. The counting produced safety through control, but it cost her dignity, because being protected and being processed used the same hands. On a board near administration, she saw posted obligations toward prisoners. In 1939, in a Berlin apartment that still believed in ordinary years, Marta Schaefer lifted the oven door with a cloth and pulled out a loaf of dark rye bread. The crust crackled, the kitchen filled with warm, bitter scent, and she took it as proof that the state could keep life steady. That faith cost her nothing at first, which was exactly why it rooted so deeply. By 1942, the ration card in their drawer had become a knife and pencil document. Marta walked with her mother to the distribution office, stood in a line that advanced by inches, and watched a clerk tear stamps with the clean impatience of routine. They carried home a bag that felt lighter against her mother's hip, and Marta learned a new fact. Hunger could be administered like paperwork. On the way back, they stopped at a notice board where new limits were posted in neat columns. Marta read the numbers and tried to translate them into meals, then into weeks, then into a future that still made sense. The board offered clarity without comfort, and the consequence was immediate. Every radio promise of temporary measures began to sound like an order to pretend. Bread became the place where policy left grit. Bakeries stretched flour with bran, potato powder, beet residue, anything that held a loaf together, and the crumb grew heavier and darker as if it had absorbed the city's smoke. In the stairwell, neighbors whispered that some batches carried wood dust or cellulose, and the rumor traveled because people needed a villain they could swallow. Marta bit into one loaf and felt hard specks between her teeth. The result was a sharp, dirty crunch that forced her to chew slowly, and the cost was a new shame because she realized she was consuming the war itself. Her mother adapted without speeches. She measured substitutions with the care of a pharmacist, saved the best slice for Marta when guests were present, and hummed an old folk tune while kneading as if melody could cover scarcity. The bread still came out warm, but the warmth became a mask. The cost was that Marta learned how adults hide hunger from children and how children learn to lie back. Coffee changed too, into a thin substitute made from roasted chicory and whatever else could be burned into bitterness. Marta drank it because warmth still mattered, and the mug still made her hands feel human. What it cost was subtle. The kitchen kept producing imitations, and she began to accept imitation as normal. In 1943, her body answered before her politics did. Her skirt loosened, her wrists sharpened in the wash basin mirror, and she counted stairs as if the day were a march. The result was constant light-headed vigilance, and the price was a new hunger for certainty, because uncertainty made hunger feel endless. A recruitment talk at her school arrived with that certainty packaged as service. A man in an official coat described women's auxiliary duties as safe, honorable work with priority provisions, speaking as if the state were a parent who could be relied on when things were hard. Marta asked what priority meant. He answered with slogans that sounded like numbers without being numbers. Hope slid into her like a warm drink, and it cost her the caution she should have kept. At home, she told her mother she would volunteer, framing it as contribution and relief. Her mother did not forbid her. She only held Marta's hands as if trying to memorize them before someone else claimed them. Marta read the silence as permission and left, carrying her family's hunger like a wager she had personally signed. In early 1944, her first meal in service did not resemble relief. The coffee was thin substitute, the bread dense and grey, and the portions felt engineered to keep a body upright, not well. Marta swallowed it and told herself it was delay, not lie, that self-command trained her to treat disappointment as discipline, which is how the system kept her quiet. She lived on small routines, folding blankets, sorting message slips, standing at attention while her stomach tightened and released like a faulty hinge. It kept her useful, and usefulness protected her from being singled out. But the cost was a trap. Each day she proved she could function without being fed properly, making it easier for the promise to remain uncorrected. In March, she was sent west into occupied France with a communications unit that moved when maps told it to move. She carried paper, wire, and coded routines, and she watched supply trucks arrive late or not at all. She still had purpose, but the consequence was corrosive. She could feel the promised priority dissolving into dust. When the radios went quiet at odd hours, Marta understood it meant more than static. It meant rails bombed, fuel scarce, routes cut, and an army trying to run on fumes. Fear no longer needed gunfire to be real, and hunger began to mirror the unit's hunger. Both were symptoms of a logistics chain that was breaking. Called names in English and handed out paper that made women either stand taller or fold inward. Marta listened for Schaefer, then watched the sack empty without hearing it. Waiting became structure. Dread became the fee. Because silence from a bombed city could mean anything. She began counting days as if counting could force a reply. 6 weeks became 7, then 8, and each evening's failure made the next evening heavier. Anticipation trained her mind like a drill, and it cost her rest, because she started to fear good news too. Good news would arrive wrapped in proof of how close she had come to losing everything. At night she dreamed in bright fragments. In one dream, her mother turned over rubble with bare hands, searching for something edible among broken brick and ash, while Marta stood behind her, unable to help because her hands were full of a tray. Marta woke sweating, and sweet pie began to taste like accusation because her mind had paired sugar with guilt. Marta started watching the camp's food as if it were a map. She noticed storage rooms, delivery routines, and the way guards complained about taste while still eating until full. The lesson was brutal. Abundance was not magic, it was capacity. The cost was bitterness, because she realized Germany's promises had been light, partly because they had never been backed by reliable supply. She heard that prisoners could be assigned to work details, kitchens, maintenance, agricultural labor, jobs that kept the camp running and filled labor gaps outside the wire. Some women spoke of detachments sent to fields in the Delta to pick cotton under guard, earning small credits and burning calories they could now afford to burn. Captivity offered choices inside a cage. The cost was risk, because choosing meant entering deeper into the captor's system. Marta chose the kitchen because it was the closest place where food turned from symbol into craft. She asked Moore in broken English whether she could work there, and he approved it if she followed rules and accepted supervision. Permission came and shame followed, because she was requesting entry into the enemy's machinery and could feel her pride flinch. In the kitchen, heat and grease coated the air, and the smell of boiling starch replaced the mess hall's shock with labor's steadier rhythm. A sergeant named Tucker supervised the line and gave Marta simple tasks at first: peeling, carrying, scrubbing, because trust is granted in measured portions. Routine returned. Pride paid the bill, because she had once handled coded messages and now handled potato skins. Tucker showed her how gravy was built from drippings and flour, explaining ratios with the seriousness of a man who understood feeding was governance. He demonstrated how pressing meat too hard made it dry, and how leaving it too loose made it fall apart. And Marta watched his hands as if they were teaching philosophy without claiming to. The skill was repeatable, and its cost was indictment. It proved feeding could be made reliable when a system wanted it to be. At the sink, a corporal named Chen worked beside her, and they traded words: potato, kartoffel. Each syllable rinsed under running water. Marta laughed once at her own pronunciation, then glanced around as if laughter were forbidden. The laughter made her feel human again, and it made her confused because hatred cannot stay pure when the enemy responds like a person. Kitchen work changed her relationship to the mess hall. When she served trays, she felt less like a mouth being managed and more like a person contributing to a process. Dignity returned in small doses, and it carried a price. It made her earlier obedience look foolish, because dignity here came from labor and rules, not from slogans. In early May 1945, a radio announcement moved through the camp. Hitler was dead. Some prisoners wept, some stared, some cursed softly, and Marta lay on her bunk afterward, trying to locate grief or relief, but finding blankness where certainty used to be. The announcement ended an era, and it left a debt. She had to decide what, if anything, had been worthy of her hunger. Late spring brought a reply from Berlin in a trembling hand. Marta read that her parents were alive. She read that the city had been hit again and again. She read that her mother's health had collapsed under prolonged shortage and fear. Relief hit so sharply her knees weakened and pressure followed immediately, because now she had to decide whether home was duty or ruin. And either choice would hurt someone she loved. In 1946, captivity began to turn toward release, and Marta faced her decision like another ration calculation. She heard talk of repatriation lists and shipping dates and understood that Germany would mean rubble and renewed scarcity, while remaining in America, if it were possible at all, would mean living with the scandal of where she had been fed. A fork appeared in her life. Obligation sharpened it. Because her mother's illness gave each option a wound, Marta chose repatriation first because she could not accept the idea of safety purchased only by distance. She surrendered camp-issued items, received processing papers, and boarded transport with other former prisoners, carrying her notebook like a private ledger. She crossed the ocean without chains and paid with dread because she was returning to the place where hunger had been normalized. Germany greeted her with damp ash and missing roofs. She found her parents, touched her mother's shoulders, and felt how light the bones had become, and stepped into a kitchen where the old rye smell had been replaced by thin soup and cold air. Reunion happened, and it confirmed the nightmare. Survival at home had been measured in substitutions and exhaustion. Marta tried to describe the camp without describing the food, believing silence would protect her mother from envy. She spoke about rules, guards, work, anything that sounded neutral, and her mother listened with a face that refused to ask the obvious question. Silence kept the peace, and it isolated Marta because she withheld the single fact that explained why her survival now felt morally complicated. She worked among ruins and watched black market exchanges shape daily life more than any speech. Cigarettes, soap, and tinned goods became currency, and Marta saw hunger turning neighbors into negotiators. The days moved, but the cost was cynicism, because scarcity could outlive a regime and still control people. A letter arrived from an American she recognized from camp work, someone who spoke plainly and offered marriage as a bridge back across the ocean. Marta weighed it like a tool, not a romance, because sentiment had never fed her. The offer created a path, and it damaged her identity, because taking the path meant accepting that her future could be built through the side she had been trained to hate. Marta married him and returned to the United States legally, stepping into Georgia with a life that looked ordinary from the street. Work, a small house, later children. Stability arrived, and it demanded its price immediately, a locked mouth, because explaining her path would require naming the hunger Germany had fed with slogans and the fact that captivity had fed her better. She learned quickly that an accent can function like a verdict. Marta avoided arguments, avoided politics, and avoided telling stories that began in 1944 because she did not want her children to inherit enemies by name. The house stayed calm, and the cost was omission, because omission is how a survivor keeps the present from collapsing. Her children grew up in a country where meals arrived without stamps. Marta shopped, cooked, packed lunches, and watched them eat with the casual confidence of people who expected the next meal. Motherhood gave her purpose, and it charged her memory as rent. Each ordinary bite echoed her first meat patty, as if the past was still seated beside her. Each year, when December approached, a date returned with the force of a private anniversary. Marta marked December 12th without telling anyone what it marked and made meat patties in her own kitchen, repeating steps with a precision that felt like prayer. The ritual kept her life coherent, and it kept the past practice too, because the body remembers what the mouth refuses to say. On December the 12th, 1970 in Atlanta, she pressed ground beef into a mold the way Tucker had shown her, firm enough to hold, not so hard it would turn dry. She browned the patty, stirred flour into drippings, and added liquid until gravy formed, thickening in the same steady way she had once watched behind barbed wire. The dinner looked ordinary. The cost was knowledge. Her hands knew exactly where the method came from, and that knowledge tightened her throat. Steam rose and touched her face, and Marta stopped moving. In her mind, the mess hall door opened again. She smelled meat and fat, and heard forks scraping and women swallowing survival through tears. Past and present laid over each other like glass, and the price was scandalous clarity. The side she had been told to love had starved her, and the side she had been told to hate had fed her by rule. Her husband called from the living room about the television, and her children moved through homework and ordinary complaints. Marta returned to motion and carried the pan to the table. Dinner was served, and she paid with performance, because she could not explain the script that had brought her here without breaking someone else's world. Her daughter asked why she made this meal every year, and Marta felt the question scrape like metal on metal. She saw her daughter's healthy face and realized the explanation would require bringing her mother's hunger and her own captivity onto the same plate. She chose silence, and the cost was that she answered only, "It's a little salty," turning a lifetime into seasoning. After dinner, she slid the plates into the dishwasher and shut the door. The machine began its heavy rumble, and the house returned to ordinary noises. Normalcy restored itself, and her truth stayed unwashed because no cycle cleanse what is never spoken. Years later, Marta reread her notebook and the questions she had written as a prisoner. She still could not find a sentence that balanced the paradox without sounding like betrayal. Silence continued, and it collected its final cost as inheritance. Her children received a ritual without its meaning, and learned by example that some hungers last longer than food.